Ruth Calloway learned to read silence the way other people read weather. 31 years as a registered nurse had given her that. The quiet before a monitor flatlines. The pause before a family hears news that will split their lives in two. The stillness of a hallway at 3 in the morning when something has already gone wrong and the building just hasn't caught up yet. She carried that skill with her into the parking lot of a strip mall on the south side of Phoenix, Arizona, where she had been living for the past 4 months, in a 2003 Buick LeSabre with a cracked rear window and a heater that worked only when it felt like it. Phoenix in October was warm enough during the day to fool you. The desert sun hammered the asphalt, turned the sidewalks white, made the air shimmer above the hoods of parked cars. But at night, the temperature dropped fast and hard, the way the desert always did, pulling heat back into the sky like it was taking something it had only loaned. Ruth had 3 blankets. She slept with 2 over her and 1 underneath between her body and the seat, because the cold came up through the metal frame and into her bones in ways that didn't show up until morning, when she had to flex her fingers for 10 minutes before they worked properly. She was 68 years old. She had worked every year of her adult life, raised a son, buried a husband, kept a house on Crestwood Lane in North Phoenix for 22 years. She had paid that mortgage down to nothing. She had planted roses along the front walk and repainted the shutters herself twice because the Arizona sun bleached everything back to gray if you didn't stay ahead of it. She had not planned to be here. 4 months ago, Dale had come to her with papers. Dale, her son, 41 years old and soft around the middle with his father's forehead and none of his father's character. He had come with his wife Sherry, who always stood slightly behind him in the way of a person who has already decided the outcome of the conversation and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. The papers Dale had explained were a protective trust arrangement, a way to safeguard her assets, he said, a way to make sure she was taken care of, he said. His hands had been steady when he laid the documents on her kitchen table, but his eyes had moved to Sherry twice in the span of 30 seconds. Quick, sideways glances, the kind that don't mean anything unless you've spent 3 decades reading people who are frightened or hiding something. Ruth had read them. She had not signed them that day. She had told Dale she needed time to look them over. She had called her friend Barbara, who had a nephew who worked in real estate law. The nephew had called her back in 2 days and used words like power of attorney transfer and property conveyance and irrevocable trust assignment. He had said the word irrevocable very carefully, the way people say a word when they want to make sure you understand it means what it means. He had told her not to sign anything. She had called Dale and told him she wasn't going to sign. 2 weeks later, she came home from a grocery run to find the locks changed. There had been a process server waiting on the front step with documents claiming she had already signed the trust agreement. The signature on the paperwork was hers, or something close enough to hers that it would take an expert and money she didn't have to prove otherwise. The trust named Dale as sole administrator. The trust had been recorded 3 weeks earlier before she had even seen the original documents. She had called the police. They had explained that this was a civil matter. She had called Barbara. Barbara had called the nephew. The nephew had gone quiet and then said very carefully that this was beyond what he could help with and that she needed a litigation attorney. Litigation attorneys required retainers. Retainers required money she could not access because the accounts had been transferred. She had $47 in cash and a Buick that was paid off because she had paid it off years ago with a check from her own account, a fact that could not be undone. She had driven to a church parking lot and sat in the car for a long time. Then she had driven to the south side of Phoenix, where the rent was low and nobody asked questions, and parked in the lot behind a strip mall on Garfield Avenue, 2 blocks from a bar called the Rusty Anchor, where a group of motorcycles gathered every evening with the reliability of something tidal, pulling in at dusk and pulling out sometime before midnight. She had not chosen the location for any reason, except that it was off a main road. The lot was partially obscured by a concrete retaining wall, and there was a gas station bathroom 60 yards away that stayed unlocked until 11 and opened again at 6. She learned the rhythms of the place the way she had always learned the rhythms of places, by watching without appearing to watch. The strip mall housed a nail salon, a payday loan office, a burger counter that closed at 9, and a door at the far end with no sign, just a hand-painted numeral beside the entrance, which she learned was called the Wolves' Den, the unofficial gathering space for the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, Phoenix chapter. She had heard of motorcycle clubs. She had not had an opinion about them that extended beyond a vague awareness that they existed. She formed an opinion slowly over the first 2 weeks, watching from the darkness of her car. They were loud. They were large men with ink up their forearms and vests covered in patches she couldn't read from this distance. They played music that came through the walls in waves when the door opened. They drank beer in the parking lot and talked in groups, and occasionally someone would say something that made the whole group laugh, a burst of it that carried across the lot and reached her where she sat. They were also, she noticed, careful about certain things. Nobody parked in the space directly in front of the nail salon entrance, even when the lot was crowded. They left a clear lane along the retaining wall, always. When someone arrived on a motorcycle with a child passenger, the whole group quieted, slightly shifted, made room without being asked. There was a choreography to how they moved around each other that reminded her strangely of good hospital staff. People who have worked together long enough that communication happens before words do. She noticed the little girl on the third night. She arrived on the back of a large motorcycle driven by a man whose vest said something she couldn't read from her distance. The girl was perhaps 7 years old, wearing a pink helmet 2 sizes too large, the chin strap hanging loose, and red boots with lights in the soles that blinked when she hit the ground. She landed with both feet and immediately began a complicated dance that involved spinning in circles and jumping over the white lines painted on the asphalt. The man with the large vest watched her with the particular expression of a person who is trying very hard not to smile and failing completely. He was not a small man. He was the kind of man that rooms noticed when he walked into them, with a wide back and gray threaded through a dark beard, and the kind of posture that comes from decades of deciding where to put yourself and having those decisions respected. The patch on his back said, Iron Wolves, and below that a howling wolf head in white thread, and below that one word, Stone. She watched him crouch down to tighten the helmet strap on the little girl. His hands were enormous compared to the buckle, and he worked at it with the concentrated delicacy of someone diffusing something. The girl stood still for approximately 4 seconds, then went back to her spinning. Stone straightened and watched her and did not smile, but his whole face softened in a way that faces only soften for specific things. Ruth looked away. She had not meant to feel anything about what she saw. She was not a sentimental woman by nature. 31 years in emergency rooms had moved her past the kind of sentimentality that breaks at first sight. But something about the gap between the man's size and the gentleness of his hands on that tiny buckle caught in her chest like a splinter, and she sat with it for a while before she started the car, drove to the gas station, used the bathroom, bought a cup of coffee with coins from the cup holder, and drove back to her spot. She did not go near the parking lot. The second night after seeing the girl, Ruth saw the glass. She had gotten out of the car to walk the cramp out of her legs, as she did most evenings, a slow circuit of the strip mall perimeter, and she had passed along the edge of the Iron Wolves lot. A bottle had shattered near the entrance, probably during the previous night, and the pieces had spread in a fan pattern across the path where the little girl had been dancing. Large pieces, irregular, catching the glow of the security light above the door in sharp flashes. Ruth stood and looked at it. She was not the sort of person who walked past broken glass on a path where a child played. She had never been that sort of person. She went back to her car, found the folded paper grocery bag she kept on the floor of the back seat, and returned to the lot. She picked up the glass piece by piece, careful of the edges, and placed it in the bag. Nobody saw her. She tied the bag and put it in the dumpster behind the burger counter and went back to her car. The night after that, she found a nail head protruding from a wooden pallet someone had left beside the entrance. She found a flat rock and hammered it down flush. The night after that, it was a slick patch of motor oil near the bike rack, dangerous underfoot, which she absorbed with a handful of the sand-like aggregate from the planting bed at the corner of the building. Nobody asked her to do these things. Nobody told her to. She did them because she was Ruth Calloway, and she had been a nurse for 31 years, and she was constitutionally incapable of walking past a hazard without addressing it. She had also, if she was honest with herself, begun to time her walks for when the little girl was present. The girl's name was Lily. She heard it called across the lot, and later she heard it said with the particular emphasis parents use when they mean, "Stop doing that right now." Lily Hargrove, Stone's daughter. She seemed to have no mother in the picture, or none that Ruth could see, which perhaps explained why Stone looked at her the way he did, with an attention that was not anxious, but was comprehensive. A man who has decided that this particular small person is the most important fixed point in his existence, and who organizes everything else around that fact. Ruth had loved her own son that way once. She still did in the complicated fashion of people who have been hurt by the very thing they love most. A love that doesn't stop but changes shape, grows a hard outer layer, learns to occupy less space. She did not think about Dale during her evening circuits. She thought about what needed to be done. She had contacted a legal aid clinic in downtown Phoenix and had an appointment in 3 weeks. She had written everything down: dates, conversations, the name of the notary on the fraudulent documents, the name of the bank officer who had processed the account transfers. She kept the notebook under the driver's seat. She had nothing else to do with her evenings except this. The weeks settled into a rhythm. During the days she went to the library, which opened at 9 and stayed open until 6, and was air-conditioned and had computers she could use for 1 hour at a time. She researched elder fraud law. She found cases similar to hers. She learned the names of attorneys who took cases on contingency for seniors who had been defrauded. She wrote letters. She sent emails from a free account she had set up. She ate 1 meal a day at the senior center on Van Buren, which offered lunch at a sliding scale that went all the way to free, and she supplemented with whatever she could carry from the food bank 2 blocks south that distributed on Tuesdays and Fridays. In the evenings, she walked. She moved glass and nails and oil spills. She watched the iron wolves gather and disperse. She watched Lily spin in the parking lot and play an intricate game involving the white parking lines that apparently had rules she was making up as she went. She watched Stone watch Lily with that comprehensive, organizing attention. She did not speak to any of them. She was not there to speak to them. She was there because the lot was positioned correctly relative to the gas station, and the dumpsters were large enough, and nobody looked at a woman her age twice. She was invisible in the way people become invisible when the world decides they don't matter. She had been invisible her whole nursing career in the sense that nurses are always invisible, the machinery that keeps everything running, noticed only when absent. She had been invisible to Dale and Sherry in the way that people become invisible to those who have already decided to reduce them to an obstacle or an asset. She had been invisible in this parking lot for 4 months, a gray-haired woman in a green windbreaker moving along the edges of other people's lives. She was good at it. She had 1 appointment at the legal aid clinic, then a second, and was told there was a strong case for fraud. The attorney, a young woman named Patricia, who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke with the kind of careful precision that indicated someone who had learned to manage expectations early, told her that the case would likely take 6 to 8 months to work through the courts, possibly longer. That the fraudulent documents would need to be challenged. That the property transfer could potentially be reversed. That potentially was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Ruth had nodded and thanked her and driven back to the Buick. She was 2 weeks from the court date when the next stage of the legal process would begin, when she heard the phone call. It was a Thursday evening, late October. The desert dark had come down fast, the temperature already dropping below 60, and Ruth had come out of her car to walk her circuit before the chill made it too unpleasant. She had her windbreaker and the thick cardigan she'd bought at the Goodwill on Central, and she kept her hands in her pockets and her head slightly down, which was the posture she had developed over 4 months of being a woman alone in parking lots at night. Purposeful, but small. Moving with direction, but not urgency. She had come around the corner of the strip mall to the edge of the Iron Wolves lot when she heard the voice. Dale's voice. She stopped. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, the way you hear a familiar sound in an unfamiliar place, and your brain manufactures meaning before the signal fully arrives. But then she heard it again, and this time there was no question. He was 20 feet away, standing beside a dark truck parked against the retaining wall, his back to her. He had his phone to his ear. The truck was not his. It had out-of-state plates and a rental sticker on the bumper. She stepped back into the shadow beside the dumpster. She heard enough. She had spent 31 years listening to conversations in hospital corridors, learning to filter signal from noise to catch the word in the sentence that tells you what's really being said. She heard before the court date. She heard can't have her talking to anyone. She heard make it look simple. She heard a number that was a dollar amount. She heard her son say it and understood all of it. He was standing 20 feet from her in a parking lot in Phoenix, arranging for someone to hurt her, and he was doing it in the same tone of voice he had used at 10 years old to ask her to bring him a glass of water. The voice of someone who expects to be accommodated, who has never considered that the accommodation might not come. She stood in the shadow and felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite anger. It was the feeling she had carried into rooms where families were about to receive the worst news of their lives. A kind of hard, particular stillness. The understanding that what was coming could not be stopped, only navigated. Only survived or not survived. She pressed herself flatter against the wall. Dale finished the call. He got back in the truck. The truck left. Ruth stood in the shadow for a long time. The Iron Wolves lot was settling into its evening pattern. The music through the walls, the clump of boots on asphalt, the low rumble of arriving bikes. Lily was there. Ruth could see the blinking lights of the red boots tracing arcs in the far corner of the lot. Ruth thought about driving away. She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything, with the methodical attention she had given to every problem for 68 years. She could be in Tucson by midnight. She had $47 in a 3/4 tank of gas and a notebook full of evidence under the driver's seat. She thought about Patricia at the legal aid clinic, who had said the case was strong, who had said potentially, who had said 6 to 8 months. She thought about the court date 2 weeks from now. And then she thought about Lily spinning in the red boots and about Dale's voice in the dark, saying the words she had heard, and she understood something clearly and without drama. Whoever Dale had called was coming tonight. Because the court date was 2 weeks out, and Dale was not a man who let problems develop. He was a man who let Sherry tell him what to do. And Sherry was not a woman who waited when she could act. Ruth went back to her car. She got her phone, a prepaid she had bought with birthday money from Barbara. She had Detective Mara Voss's card in the back of the notebook. Voss was the detective who had taken her initial report 4 months ago and who had said, "civil matter," with a tone that suggested she knew it was more than that, but couldn't prove it yet. Ruth called. Voicemail. She left a message with everything she had heard, every word she could remember. The truck description, the partial plate, the time, the location. She spoke clearly and without inflection, because hysterical women got dismissed, and she had not survived 4 months in a Buick LeSabre to be dismissed now. Then she sat in the car and waited. She watched the lot. An hour passed. The music from the den changed twice. Lily disappeared inside with Stone at around 8:30. The bikes were stacked along the retaining wall chrome, catching the security lights. Ruth watched the street beyond the lot entrance with the particular attention of someone who has learned that danger moves in patterns. At 9:17, a truck rolled past the lot entrance. Dark, slow, the lights slightly too dim for a city street. It made the pass and kept going. Ruth's hands tightened on the steering wheel. At 9:23, it came back, slower. She got out of the car. She didn't have a plan. She was 68 years old with 2 broken glass wounds on her right hand from the week before and a cardigan from Goodwill. She was not a woman who had ever believed in plans in the way that people believe in them before the moment arrives, because she had spent 31 years in emergency rooms, and she knew that what mattered when everything went wrong was not the plan. It was what you could do in the 8 seconds before the situation hardened into something irreversible. She moved toward the lot entrance. The truck had come to a stop just past the far edge of the retaining wall, in the shadow between the street and the light. The den door opened. Lily came out running. The red boots hit the asphalt and began their bouncing pattern immediately, the game with the painted lines, the complicated, invented rules. Stone appeared in the doorway behind her, holding a bottle, saying something to the man beside him. Lily was 10 feet from where Ruth was standing at the edge of the lot. The truck's door opened. A man got out. He was not Dale. He was younger, broader, wearing a jacket that was too heavy for the October evening. He moved with the particular purposefulness of someone who has been given a task and is completing it, not thinking about it. His eyes went to Ruth for half a second and then passed her to Lily. Ruth moved. She was not fast. She had not been fast since she was 45, but she had spent decades moving through tight spaces around beds and carts and equipment, and she had the particular economy of motion that comes from knowing exactly what your body can and cannot do and committing completely to what it can. She put herself between the man and Lily. She heard Stone's voice behind her change register the drop in pitch. That means something has been recognized as wrong. The man pulled out a gun. Everything that happened next happened in approximately 4 seconds. Ruth grabbed Lily's arm and pulled her down and back and turned her own body toward the gun, the way she had once turned toward code blue alarms with everything she had, which was not much but was all of it. She heard the shot and felt it as a sound and an impact simultaneously, as if the two things were one. The second shot came while she was still falling and hit somewhere in the same vicinity as the first, and the pain was enormous and immediate, and she registered it the way she had always registered very bad things, with a clarity that was almost abstract. She hit the asphalt on her side. Lily was underneath her, held down, small and warm, vibrating with a soundless scream. "Stay down," Ruth said, because it was what she knew to say. "Stay still. You're safe." After that, there were voices, many of them. There were boots on asphalt and the sound of the truck engine, and then the sound of it leaving fast tires on grit. There was Stone's voice, very close, saying something she couldn't parse and then saying, "Don't move her," with the authority of someone who had some idea of what not moving people meant. There were hands. She could tell from the pressure how many and approximately where they were. The pain had spread from the specific to the general, which was a direction pain moved in when it was serious, and she knew it was serious in the way nurses know these things from a long list of data points that assembled themselves without her asking them to. She turned her head. Stone was on one knee beside her. This close, he was larger than she had realized, the kind of large that doesn't register properly until you are at the same level. His face had done something complicated that she didn't have the resources to fully read. He was looking at her the way she had seen people look when they were revising a story they thought they knew. "Ruth," Lily said from somewhere beneath her arm. She had not told the girl her name. She tried to remember when she had told the girl her name. "She knows who you are," Stone said, reading her expression. His voice had gone low level, the voice of a man working to keep himself controlled. "She's seen you before. She told me about the woman in the green coat who fixed the glass." He paused. "I thought she made you up." Ruth tried to say something, and what came out was not words. "Don't." He put one hand near her shoulder, not touching. "Careful. Help is coming. You don't have to do anything except stay here." From somewhere behind her, she heard the sound of motorcycles starting. Not all at once, but in sequence. One, and then another, and then 3 more. And then the whole group, a roll of thunder building on itself. "Where are they going?" she managed. Stone looked up briefly. "With you," he said. That's what we do. The sirens arrived not long after red and blue painting the retaining wall in cycles. Ruth lay on the asphalt of a parking lot in South Phoenix and looked up at the October sky, which was clear and full of stars, the way desert skies are indifferent and enormous, and she thought with some detachment that she had lived a very particular kind of life, and that this was not how she had imagined it ending. But she was still thinking, which meant it had not ended yet. The paramedics were good. They moved with the purposeful efficiency she recognized. She let them work. She had spent 31 years on the other side of this transaction, and she knew the proper etiquette, which was to provide information when asked and stay out of the way otherwise. She told them what she could. She told them she was Ruth Calloway, 68, no allergies, blood type O positive, no history of bleeding disorders. One of them looked up sharply. "You a nurse?" "Was," she said. "Then you know what we're dealing with." "Yes," she said. "Don't think about it." "I'm not," she said, and she wasn't. She was thinking about the notebook under the driver's seat of her car. She was thinking about Detective Voss's voicemail. She was thinking about Patricia and the word potentially and the court date 2 weeks out. They loaded her onto a gurney. She watched the strip mall ceiling pass above her, and then the open sky, and then the inside of the ambulance, which was familiar in the way that hospitals and medical settings were always familiar to her. A known country. She became aware then of the sound that surrounded the ambulance as it moved. She couldn't see outside, but she could hear, and what she heard was engines. Not one or two, many, moving in formation around the vehicle. She turned her head toward the paramedic. "Iron wolves," he said. "They're running escort, every one of them." He had a look on his face that was professional and controlled, but underneath it something else was working. "I've done this run 100 times. I've never had a motorcycle escort before." "How many?" Ruth asked. He glanced toward the back window. 35, he said, give or take. Ruth processed this. She thought about Stone in the parking lot on one knee saying, "That's what we do." She thought about Lily's voice saying her name. The pain was very serious now, which was information she was familiar with. She organized what she knew, which was her habit. She had 2 gunshot wounds. She was being transported to a hospital by people who knew what they were doing. There were 35 motorcycles surrounding the vehicle. She had evidence of elder fraud in a notebook under the driver's seat of a car parked behind a strip mall on Garfield Avenue, and she had a voicemail sitting with Detective Mara Voss that contained more information than Dale or Sherry knew she had. She was not out of moves. "Hey," the paramedic leaned close. "Still with me?" "Yes," Ruth said, because she was. She always had been. The hospital floodlights came into view, and the ambulance turned, and the escorts turned with it. 35 engines adjusting their course in concert, and she heard someone say outside that they had never seen anything like this. When the doors opened, the night came in cold and clear, and she heard the engines still running. Stone appeared at the edge of her vision, keeping pace beside the gurney, his hand gripping the rail covered in blood that she recognized without sentimentality as hers. "I'm here," he said. "You're not doing this alone." She had been doing everything alone for 4 months. She had become very good at it. She had believed in the way a person comes to believe the thing they've had to accept, that it was simply the condition of her particular existence. But she was a woman who knew how to read silence. And what she heard in Stone Hargrove's voice as they moved through the hospital doors was not pity and not obligation. It was the particular quality of someone who means what they say because they understand what it costs. She held on to that as the lights above her multiplied and the voices rose and the work of saving her life began. Outside, 35 engines idled in the hospital parking lot and did not leave. The operating room was cold in the way operating rooms are always cold. A deliberate cold, controlled and purposeful, because warmth invites contamination, and the body of a surgical patient needs to be treated as a system rather than a person for the duration of the procedure. Ruth understood this. She had circulated surgical supply carts for 6 years before moving to emergency medicine. She knew the smell of the room, the particular quality of the overhead light, the sounds of preparation. She was no longer on the delivery side of this. There were 3 people working above her, and 2 others moving at the edges of her vision, retrieving and passing. They spoke in the shortened language of people who have worked together long enough to communicate in fragments. She let them work. She kept her eyes open as long as she could because she had a nurse's instinctive resistance to losing consciousness in a clinical setting. You stayed alert as long as you were able. You noted what you observed. You updated your assessment. What she observed was that they were good at their jobs. The surgeon was a woman in her late 40s with gray at her temples, and steady hands, and the economy of movement that distinguished people who had done a thing many thousands of times from people who had done it many hundreds of times. She spoke to Ruth once, just before the anesthesia. "You're a nurse, not a question." "Was," Ruth said. "Again, then you know we're going to take care of you." A pause. "And you know you need to let us." Ruth understood the subtext. Nurses made difficult patients because they monitored their own care and questioned decisions, and sometimes fought the process instead of receiving it. She had seen it. She had done it herself years ago when she had broken a finger at work and spent the entire treatment trying to assess her own x-rays. "All right," she said. The cold moved into her veins and the light above her stretched and flattened. And she held one thought as the last anchoring point before she went under. The notebook under the driver's seat. The voicemail with Voss. The court date. 2 weeks. She did not dream that she knew of. She surfaced once briefly in a gray and unlocated space and heard voices and felt the weight of blankets and went back down. The second time she surfaced, it was with more purchase, something solid to come back to. The pain was present but organized, sorted into categories she could understand. This is wound pain. This is surgical aftermath. This is muscle reaction. She cataloged it, which made it manageable. The ceiling was white tile. The light was dimmer than the OR. A monitoring machine beeped at intervals she recognized as acceptable. Stone was in the chair beside her bed. He was not asleep. He was sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely linked, watching her with the same comprehensive attention she had watched him watch Lily with in the parking lot. He was still wearing the vest. The front of it had dried blood on it. Her blood, probably. She wasn't sure how much had been transferred during the 30 seconds he had knelt beside her before the paramedics arrived. "You're awake," he said. "I appear to be," she said. Her voice was dry. He reached for the water cup on the tray without being asked, positioned the straw, held it at the right angle. Correct instinct without instruction. She took a small sip, then another. Cold water, which was not as miraculous as it had been in the years when she was young and healthy, and had always had as much water as she wanted, was nonetheless very good. "How long?" she said. "Surgery was 4 hours. You've been in and out since. It's been about 18 hours total." He set the cup down. "The surgeon says you'll need time, but no permanent damage. The second shot missed anything vital by 1.5 inches." Ruth absorbed this with the equanimity of someone who had heard worse odds delivered in worse ways. "And Lily, not a scratch." Something moved in his expression. "You made sure of that?" "She was the target," Ruth said. Stone's jaw moved. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "The man who came wasn't there for Lily. He was there for you." He leaned forward slightly. "You told us in the ambulance before they put you under. Something about a phone call, a truck, Dale." He paused. "Detective Voss came this morning. She got your voicemail." Ruth let out a slow breath. "She wants to talk to you when you're able." Stone's voice was even, but there was something working underneath it. A controlled anger, the kind that has been given a specific channel to move through. "We want to talk to you too. When you're ready, no rush." "I'm ready now," Ruth said. He looked at her for a moment. "You've been awake for approximately 90 seconds. I've assessed the situation. I'm ready." She paused. "I've been managing this alone for 4 months. I'm not interested in waiting when waiting doesn't help." Something shifted in Stone's expression. Not surprise exactly, More like recognition, the look of a person who has encountered a version of a thing they already understand. All right, he said, then tell me. She told him everything. She was precise and linear. She gave him dates and amounts and names. She told him about the fake trust documents and the changed locks and the bank accounts and Patricia at the legal aid clinic. She told him about the notebook. She told him about the prepaid phone and the voicemail and Dale standing against the retaining wall outside the lot with his back to her, speaking into a phone, using words that meant what she knew they meant. Stone listened without interrupting. He had the quality of a good listener, the quality of someone who understands that their job in this moment is to receive information and not to process it aloud. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You've been in that lot for 4 months, he said. Sleeping in your car. Yes. And nobody in my club noticed. I wasn't trying to be noticed, Ruth said. You were moving glass, he said, off the path where Lily walks. Yes. He was quiet again, looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully parse. It was not pity. She would have recognized pity. She had been on the receiving end of it from medical staff once, years ago, and it had a particular texture she found distasteful. This was something else. It had some of the quality of the look you gave something you had failed to see properly. Lily told me, he said finally. She told me there was a lady who cleaned things up. I thought she'd imagined it, or that it was the cleaning crew. He shook his head. She described your coat, green. She said the lady was old, but she moved like she was thinking ahead. Ruth registered this without expression. Moved like she was thinking ahead. She would have been insulted by the description of old once. Now it simply seemed accurate. I don't expect anything, she said. This was important to establish. She had not come to this lot looking for help. She had not arranged to be shot. She was not here to create an obligation or a debt or a connection she could leverage. I made a decision in the moment because the situation called for it. I would have made the same decision regardless of whether you were here or not, regarding any child in that circumstance. I know, Stone said. I'm telling you so that you understand I'm not asking for anything. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. Which is exactly why I'm going to offer it anyway. He leaned forward. You need a lawyer, a real one, not legal aid. You need someone who can challenge those documents fast and hard and has the experience to do it. I know someone. He paused. You need a safe place while this gets sorted. We have a clubhouse with rooms, nothing fancy but secure, lockable, real doors. He paused again. And you need someone who can make sure that what happened last night doesn't happen again while you get to that court date. Ruth looked at him. She was 68 years old, and she had been living in a Buick LeSabre, and she was in a hospital bed with 2 gunshot wounds because her son had arranged for someone to hurt her. She was not a woman who asked for help easily. She had been raised in the generation that viewed the need for help as a failure of planning. But she was also a woman who had learned by the time she was 40 that there was a difference between refusing help out of pride and refusing it out of self-sufficiency, and that the first was weakness and the second was wisdom. And the difference was whether the help changed who you were or simply gave you more resources to be who you already were. Stone Hargrove was not offering her charity. He was offering her a tactical alliance. All right, she said. Outside the window, the light was the pale yellow of early morning in the desert. She could see from the angle of the bed a slice of the parking lot. The Iron Wolves' bikes were still there. Not all of them, perhaps, but enough to constitute a presence. Their chrome caught the morning light and threw it back in pieces. Lily appeared in the doorway. She was wearing the same red boots, no helmet now. She stopped just inside the threshold and looked at Ruth with the large-eyed assessment of a child who has been told to be careful, but who is not by nature a careful person. You're awake, Lily said. So I've been told, Ruth said. Lily came across the room in 3 quick steps and stood at the edge of the bed. She looked at the tubes and the monitors and the bandages without visible alarm. The child of a motorcycle club president, Ruth thought, had probably seen more than most children of her age. Does it hurt? Lily asked. Yes, Ruth said, because lying to children about pain was condescending and also ineffective. A lot, a medium amount, less than it did. Lily considered this. Dad says you used to fix things at night so I wouldn't get hurt. She paused. Like the glass. Yes. Why? Ruth thought about this. She had thought about it herself on various evenings, asking herself the same question because she was a woman who preferred to understand her own motivations. She had arrived at an answer that was true, even if it was not particularly poetic. Because some things are worth taking care of, she said, and a person who isn't trying to prevent harm when they can prevent it is just someone who's decided not to care. Lily absorbed this with the seriousness that children of a certain age brought to direct statements from adults. Then she nodded once, as if that was a satisfactory accounting. Okay, she said. I brought you something. She produced from her jacket pocket a drawing on folded paper. She unfolded it and smoothed it on the edge of the bed. It was a crayon drawing of a parking lot and a woman in a green coat, and beside her a small figure with red boots. Above the green coat woman, carefully colored wings. Teacher said to draw something that happened, Lily said. So I drew you. Ruth looked at the drawing for a long moment. Thank you, she said. Her voice was level. She had 31 years of practice keeping her voice level. You can keep it, Lily said. I can make more. Stone in the chair said nothing. He was watching them both with the expression of a man who is trying to understand how to account for something he did not expect. You know what, Ruth said? I believe you can. She folded the drawing carefully and held it in her lap, and outside the morning continued its rise over Phoenix, and in the parking lot, 31 motorcycles of the Iron Wolves kept their patient vigil in the growing light. Detective Mara Voss arrived at 10:30 in the morning. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, with the careful posture of someone whose job required her to be trusted by people who did not easily trust. And she had the kind of face that stayed neutral by default and moved to expression only when it chose to. She had a voice that Ruth recognized from the phone call 4 months ago, the call where she had said civil matter and meant more than that. Voss pulled the chair close and opened her notebook and looked at Ruth with professional attention. Your voicemail gave us a great deal, she said. The truck description and the partial plate match a vehicle registered to a man named Gary Tolliver, known associate of your son's business partner. We've had Tolliver in our records for 3 years on unrelated matters. She paused. The man who came to the lot last night wasn't Tolliver. Tolliver rented the truck. The man who used it was hired separately, and we're working on identifying him. He left the scene, but we have surveillance from the gas station down the street. Will it be clear enough? Ruth asked. Clear enough to establish intent. Combined with your voicemail and the testimony of witnesses in the lot, we have a picture. Voss looked at her notes. What I need from you today is a complete account of the property fraud, beginning from when your son first presented the documents. Patricia Alvarez at Legal Aid has been in contact with us and has provided the case file, but I want your account directly. Ruth told her everything she had told Stone with the same precision. Voss wrote, without looking up, the shorthand of someone who does this often. When Ruth finished, Voss sat for a moment reviewing her notes. Your son's wife, Voss said. Sherry Calloway. Sherry Parsons before the marriage. She and Dale have been married 11 years. The fraud scheme has her fingerprints on it more than his. The notary on the fake documents is her cousin. The bank officer who processed the transfers, we've looked into him. He has a connection to a property company that Sherry Calloway has been an investor in for 4 years. Voss looked up. Dale may have been the face of this, but we believe the architecture is hers. Ruth had believed the same thing for 4 months. She had not been surprised by Dale's weakness. She had been surprised initially that she had not seen Sherry's motive more clearly sooner. Then she had understood that she had seen it and had filed it under the category of things that seemed unlikely because they came from family, which was a category that corrupted accurate assessment. You have a clear shot at this, Voss said. The fraud case and now the attempted harm case. But it requires you to be available to testify and to be safe enough to do it, which means the next 2 weeks before the court date, are critical. She looked at Stone, who was standing near the window. I understand you've offered to house her while this moves through the process. We have, Stone said. Voss looked at Ruth. Your call. I can put you in a hotel under a protective detail, or you can accept the offer. She was neutral about it, professionally neutral, not steering. Ruth considered the two options. A hotel room under police protection was standard procedure and perfectly competent. The Iron Wolves were 35 motorcycles that had ridden escort to a hospital at midnight for a woman they had not known existed 3 hours prior, and whose leader had sat in a hospital chair for 18 hours and was offering the services of a lawyer he trusted. The offer, Ruth said. Voss nodded once. Then I need daily check-ins, and if anything changes with Dale or Sherry's location or activity, I need to know immediately. She handed Ruth a card with a direct line. No voicemail this time. No voicemail, Ruth agreed. After Voss left, Stone stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the parking lot. Then he turned. When you're discharged, you won't be going back to the car, he said. No, Ruth agreed. You'll come to the compound. He paused. There's a room that was my wife's workroom. We've kept it cleared. It has a window facing the yard and a lock on the door. It's yours for as long as you need it. Ruth thought about the notebook under the driver's seat of the Buick. She thought about the court date. She thought about Lily drawing wings on the woman in the green coat. She thought about what it meant to be offered a room with a window and a lock on the door when you had been sleeping in a car. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried at practical things, but she felt the weight of the offer land somewhere specific in the part of her that had been carrying everything alone for 4 months and was very, very tired of it. Thank you, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. Stone looked at her with the same expression he had worn when he found her in the parking lot. The expression of a man revising a story. Don't thank me yet, he said. You've got a legal battle and possibly another threat before this is over. The hard part hasn't happened yet. The hard part, Ruth said, happened in a parking lot at 9:17 last night. I've already done that part. He looked at her. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. Fair enough, he said. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. The Phoenix sun was doing what the Phoenix sun did, pressing down on everything with democratic intensity, bleaching the shadows and making the world look very clear and very flat and very real. Ruth lay in the hospital bed with a crayon drawing of a woman with wings in her lap and 31 motorcycles in the parking lot below her window and a court date 2 weeks away, and she began methodically and without drama to plan what came next. They discharged her on the 4th day. The surgeon, whose name was Dr. Kwan, and who had the economic manner of a woman who had made a great many consequential decisions and learned to make them without fanfare, came in on the morning of day 4 and reviewed the chart with the efficiency of someone who has already formed a conclusion and is confirming it rather than discovering it. The wounds are closing cleanly, she said. You have a nurse's instincts about rest, which means you're actually resting instead of trying to get up every 4 hours. That helps. She looked at Ruth over the chart. You'll need the dressings changed daily for the next 2 weeks. You'll need to avoid lifting anything over 10 pounds. You'll need to see a follow-up in 10 days. She paused. You have somewhere to go. Yes, Ruth said. Dr. Kwan looked at Stone, who was in the chair again. He had not, to Ruth's observation, left the hospital for more than 4 hours at a stretch, and she suspected he had been sleeping in the chair during the hours she was sleeping herself. He was wearing a different shirt, but the same vest. Lily had been brought and taken away and brought back twice, supervised by a woman named Carla, who was apparently a regular presence in the Hargrove household. A wide, cheerful woman in her 50s who hugged everyone within arm's reach and brought food in containers that she distributed without asking what anyone wanted. She'll have everything she needs, Stone told the doctor. Dr. Kwan looked at him, then at the vest, then back at Ruth. I've been a trauma surgeon in Phoenix for 19 years, she said. I've had motorcycle clubs in my waiting room before. Usually the person they're waiting on is one of theirs. She closed the chart. I've never seen one in my waiting room for a retired nurse they met 6 days ago. She paused, not unkindly. Take care of yourself. That's what I've been doing, Ruth said. The terms have just improved. They brought a wheelchair for the discharge, which Ruth accepted with grace, because she understood the hospital's liability obligations and had no interest in performing her independence at the expense of practicality. They wheeled her through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and institutional cleaning fluid, familiar smells that she had inhaled for 31 years, and out through the automatic doors into the desert heat. 42 motorcycles were in the hospital parking lot. Not all of them had been there for the entire 4 days, she understood. They rotated. Stone had explained this to her without making it sound like an explanation, the way he described most things as simple fact rather than impressive gesture. The club maintained a presence. The lot was watched. Nobody came in or out of the hospital without being seen by at least 2 people who were paying attention. They had not been wrong to maintain it. On the second day, a man had come to the information desk asking about a Ruth Calloway. He had said he was her nephew. He had given a name that was not the name of any nephew she had. The volunteer at the desk had no record of a Ruth Calloway in any room in the hospital because Stone had had her admitted under a different name on the first day, which had required a conversation with the hospital administrator that Ruth had not been present for and about which she had not asked details. The man who claimed to be her nephew had left. Stone had told her about it on the evening of the second day quietly, and she had looked at him and said, "Sherry, most likely," he had said, "she's escalating." Yes, which means she's afraid of the court date, which means, Stone had said, we're in the right position. Now Ruth sat in the wheelchair outside the automatic doors in the October Arizona heat, which was a dry heat that she had spent 40 years learning to appreciate for its clarity, its honesty. The desert did not pretend. It was hot or it was cold, and it gave you the information directly and left it to you to prepare accordingly. She had always respected that. Stone brought the truck around. Not a motorcycle, she noted, which was a practical accommodation she appreciated. Getting onto a motorcycle with 2 healing gunshot wounds would have been manageable, but unnecessary. She transferred from the wheelchair to the passenger seat with care, and he made no move to help her until she was halfway in and paused. And then he was there, one hand at her elbow, steady and non-dramatic. They drove south through Phoenix. The motorcycles formed up behind the truck, not aggressive, not showy, simply present. A loose formation of 42 men and 3 women, spreading out across the lanes, covering the approaches. Ruth watched the city out the window. She had driven these streets for 20 years before Dale and Sherry had reduced her to walking them. She knew the neighborhoods, the shifts between the parts of the city that had money and the parts that had history and the parts that had neither. She watched them pass and did not feel what she might have expected to feel, which was grief or bitterness. What she felt was something more practical. She felt like a person who had been away and was returning with more information than she'd had when she left. The Iron Wolves compound was on the south end of the city, off a commercial road that had seen better decades. The building was a repurposed warehouse, low and wide, with a chain-link perimeter and a parking area large enough for many bikes, and a separate house attached to the backside. A real house with a real yard, where Stone lived with Lily and Carla, who came in days to help with Lily's schedule. Stone showed her the room. It was on the ground floor of the house off the back hallway, with a window that looked out on the yard where a single large mesquite tree grew. The room had been cleared, as he had said, and someone had made up the bed with clean sheets, and there was a chair by the window, and a small table, and a reading lamp. On the table was a glass of water. Ruth stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a moment. "The bathroom is next door," Stone said. "Carla stocked it with whatever she thought you might need. If anything's missing, she'll be deeply offended that she failed to anticipate it and will immediately go buy it." "It's perfect," Ruth said. "Ruth." He waited until she looked at him. "You're not a guest. You're not a project. This isn't charity." He said it the way he said most things, without inflection, as established fact. "You put yourself between a bullet and my daughter. That makes you someone this household looks after. It's not complicated." She looked at him. She had been looking at him across 4 hospital days, and she had been building a picture. He was a man of 58 with a life behind him that had included hard things and losses and decisions that had not always been clean. He ran a motorcycle club that had a reputation she did not fully understand and probably did not need to, because what she had observed was that the reputation was more useful than the reality in most situations, that the primary function of it was to create space for the people he was responsible for. He had organized 35 motorcycles at midnight for a woman sleeping in a car without having been asked. He had rearranged the room where his wife used to work. She had been a nurse for 31 years, and she had learned to assess people quickly because sometimes the assessment was the most important diagnostic tool available. What she assessed in Stone Hargrove was a man whose loyalty, once extended, was not conditional. She had not had that in many years. "All right," she said, and she went into the room and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the mesquite tree in the yard, which was dropping small brown pods onto the dry grass in the October wind. And she let herself very briefly simply be somewhere safe. The lawyer's name was Edmund Briggs. He was 63, wore suspenders, and had the manner of a man who had practiced long enough to know that the most effective legal strategy was usually the one that required the least creativity and the most persistence. He came to the compound on the 5th day, sat across from Ruth at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and reviewed the situation. "The trust documents have 2 critical problems," he said. "The notary who certified your signature was present in 2 states simultaneously on the day of notarization, according to travel records. That's our primary attack. The secondary is the property transfer timeline, which preceded the document by 19 days, which is not standard practice for any legitimate trust arrangement." "It was rushed," Ruth said. "It was rushed because they expected you to sign voluntarily, and when you didn't, they had to work with what they had." He tapped the legal pad. "It's sloppy work done by someone who assumed you wouldn't have the resources to challenge it. The assumption was wrong." "Sherry Calloway ran it," Ruth said. "Dale was the name on the paperwork, but the methodology is hers." Briggs looked at her over his glasses. "Your evidence." Ruth described the voicemail to Detective Voss. She described the phone call she had overheard in the parking lot. She described Dale's voice, what he had said, the words she had memorized because she was a woman who had been trained to memorize specific language in high-stress situations. She described the truck and its plates and the subsequent investigation. Briggs listened, made notes. "The attempted harm charge is Detective Voss's territory. My territory is getting your house back." He wrote for a moment. "We're filing for emergency injunction on the property transfer. Given the evidence of fraud and the documented attempt on your life, I can make an argument to the court that the transfer itself was an element of a criminal scheme, which changes the standard for reversal." He looked up. 6 to 8 months becomes much shorter when the fraud is tied to attempted murder. "How much shorter?" "Best case, the injunction is granted within 30 days, and the reversal process starts within 60. He paused. "There are no guarantees in law." "There are no guarantees in medicine either," Ruth said. "That doesn't stop people from operating." Briggs looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something and said, "I'm going to enjoy this case." What Ruth did not know on that 5th day at the compound was that Sherry Calloway had already changed her approach. She learned it on the 7th day. Stone came in from a meeting at the clubhouse with a particular quality of controlled attention that she had come to recognize as his version of concerning news. He sat at the kitchen table. Carla, reading the room, accurately took Lily to the yard. "Dex," Stone said. She had heard the name. Dex Pruitt, a member of 3 years. She had seen him in the compound, a lean man in his mid-30s who said little and whose eyes moved constantly, which she had attributed to alertness and now understood differently. Stone laid a burner phone on the table. "We found this in his kit at the clubhouse. He'd been using it to communicate with a number that traces back to a shell company we've now connected to Sherry Calloway's investment network." He turned the phone so she could see the screen. She read the messages. They were brief and specific. They included the floor she was on at the hospital. They included the shift schedule of the security guard outside her room. They included the name and description of the man who had tried to present himself as her nephew. The most recent message from 4 days ago said, "Still in play, she's moved working on location." "He doesn't know where the compound is," Ruth asked. "He knows the general area. He doesn't know the address." Stone's jaw was tight. "But he's been here. He knows the property." Ruth processed this. A man inside the club who was feeding information to Sherry, who was feeding it to people who had already made 2 attempts. The attempts were escalating because the court date was approaching, and because with each failed attempt, the evidence against Sherry and Dale was growing. "What did you do with Dex?" she asked. "He's been confronted. He's not at the compound." Stone looked at her with the directness she had come to expect from him. "He ran, left his phone, left most of his gear. I think he panicked when he realized we'd found it. He didn't expect us to look." His voice was flat. "We've given Voss the phone. She's tracking him." He paused. "But his running means Sherry knows her channel is burned. She'll move to something else." "She'll move faster," Ruth said. "Yes, because the court date is in 8 days." "Yes." Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. She was thinking with the particular clarity she always had in emergencies, the same clarity she had brought to trauma bays and cardiac events, and the 1,000 occasions when something had gone wrong and someone needed to decide what to do next in the next 60 seconds. "We should call Voss," Ruth said. "Already done. She's on her way." Voss arrived at 1 in the afternoon with a colleague and a tablet showing a map of cell tower pings from Dex's burner phone. She sat at the table and spread out the information with the organized manner of someone presenting a brief. Dex Pruitt met in person with a woman matching Sherry Calloway's description twice in the past 10 days. Both meetings were in commercial parking lots, both cash transactions, we think, because his bank shows no deposits, but his behavior changed after each meeting. She pointed at the map. He was feeding her location data on Ruth and the club's movements. In return, we believe he was promised safe passage out of state in cash. She looked at Stone. He also gave her something else. The third message on the phone from 9 days ago says, "Incoming to 4th floor, 22002 guards." The room was quiet. "That was the attempted hospital break-in," Stone said. "Yes." Dex told them the shift timing, the floor, the room number. The fake orderlies were using information he provided. She looked at Ruth. "You spotted them before they reached you. That's the only reason the attempt failed." Ruth thought about the 3 men moving too quickly in the hallway. The clipboard held wrong. The eyes that swept and hunted. She had read those signs in 4 seconds because she had spent 31 years reading the difference between people who belonged in hospital corridors and people who didn't. The right skills in the right moment, which was not luck, which was 30 years of paying attention. "What happens now?" Ruth asked. "Dex is in the wind, but his phone stopped pinging at a rest stop near Flagstaff 4 hours ago. We think he's trying to cross state. We have his vehicle description, and we've alerted Arizona Highway Patrol." Voss looked at her notes. "The more pressing issue is that Sherry Calloway knows her back channel is burned. We expect her to move within the next 48 hours. The question is what she'll target." "Me," Ruth said. "Or the court process itself," Voss said. "We've notified the courthouse. They're increasing security around the case files and the presiding judge's calendar." She paused. "But targeting you directly is faster for her, and she's shown a preference for speed." Ruth looked at Stone. He was looking at the table with the expression he used when he was computing options. A stillness that covered active thought. "The thing about Sherry," Ruth said, "is that she thinks in terms of leverage." She had spent 4 months studying Sherry's methods the way she might study a pathology. Understanding how a system worked was the first step toward disrupting it. She doesn't remove obstacles directly if she can use them. The fraud was leverage over Dale. The trust arrangement was leverage over the house. Whatever she does next will be designed to create pressure that I respond to, rather than a direct confrontation she can be blamed for. The court date itself, Stone said. Ruth looked at him. What if she has a lawyer file something before the hearing? An emergency competency challenge. Have you declared unable to participate in your own legal proceedings? He looked at Voss. Can that be done on short notice? Voss was already typing on her tablet. It can be tried. It requires a signed medical or psychiatric statement. Given that Ruth was just hospitalized for gunshot wounds, someone could argue she's under duress and not competent to make legal decisions. She looked up. It would be a desperate move. It would also be exactly the kind of move that, if it fails, adds another charge to her case. But if it succeeds, even temporarily, it delays the hearing. It's what she'd do, Ruth said with certainty. Then we preempt it, Briggs said. He had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, listening with the attention of a man collecting evidence. I file tomorrow. I get Ruth examined today by a physician who will certify her competence, and I attach that certification to a preemptive motion establishing that any competency challenge filed after today is filed in bad faith for purposes of delay. He looked at Ruth. Are you willing to be examined today? I have 2 gunshot wounds, Ruth said. I don't have a brain injury. That, Briggs said, is exactly the kind of thing a competent person says. On the 9th day, Dex was picked up at a bus station in Albuquerque, trying to board a coach with a one-way ticket to Denver. He had less than $300 in cash. He was frightened and tired, and when Voss's contact in New Mexico police put him in a room with a detective, he cooperated with the completeness of someone who has understood that the person who gave him money has no interest in protecting him. He gave Voss everything. The 2 meetings with Sherry, the amounts, the specific information he had passed. He also gave her something she had not expected. Voss came to the compound to deliver this information personally. Ruth was in the yard under the mesquite tree, doing the careful walking that constituted her physical therapy regimen. She heard Stone's voice from inside and came in through the back door and found them at the table. Voss had a photograph on her tablet. Sherry Calloway took out a storage unit 3 days ago under a false name. The unit is in a facility on the west side. Dex told us about it. He doesn't know what's in it, but he knows she accessed it twice in the last 2 weeks. She paused. We got a warrant this morning. Ruth looked at Stone. He was looking at the photograph. What was in it? Ruth asked. Documents, Voss said. 2 years of documents. Correspondence with the notary. Payment records. Records of communication with the bank officer. She paused. And a second trust arrangement, this one naming Sherry Calloway's sister as beneficiary, that was prepared but never used. Our forensic accountant found it in 30 minutes. It appears Sherry intended to transfer the property twice. Dale to get the house from Ruth, then Sherry's sister to get it from Dale. Dale apparently didn't know. The room absorbed this. She was going to take it from him too, Stone said. Dale was a vehicle, Ruth said. She had thought as much. Sherry's management of Dale had never looked like partnership. It had looked like operation. Dale had been a signature and a face useful for establishing the legal chain unnecessary afterward. He thought he was the architect. He was the instrument. When Dale finds out, Voss said, his cooperation in this case becomes much more likely. She looked at Ruth. We're going to bring both of them in for questioning today. I wanted you to know before it happened. Ruth looked at the table. Dale, her son, 41 years old, and apparently having been used by his own wife as a pass-through for a fraud he had helped engineer, but had not fully understood. She had been angry at Dale for 4 months with the specific cellular anger of a person who has been betrayed by someone they raised. She was still angry, but what she felt now was something more complicated. Grief, perhaps, or the particular sadness of watching something that you could not have saved, even if you had seen it coming, even if you had known. When you bring Dale in, she said, tell him the thing about his wife's storage unit first, before you ask him any questions. She paused. Let him understand who he is in this situation before he decides how to respond. Voss looked at her. Why? Because I know my son, Ruth said. He is weak, and he made choices I cannot forgive. But he is not fundamentally cruel. He was convinced of something false by someone who made it seem like loyalty. She was quiet for a moment. The truth about Sherry will break something in him, and a broken man is more honest than a defensive one. Voss made a note. Outside, one of the Iron Wolves was working on a bike in the lot. The sound of a wrench on metal came through the window at intervals, methodical. Lily was at school. Carla was at the store. The house was quiet in the way it got in the late mornings, a temporary calm between the things that were still coming. Ruth stood at the kitchen window and looked at the mesquite tree and thought about the court date, which was in 6 days, and about Briggs's preemptive motion, and about Voss bringing Dale and Sherry in for questioning, and about the storage unit and the documents and the second trust, and the fact that Sherry had been running a game that was longer and colder than anyone, including Dale, had understood. She thought about being invisible. She had been invisible in that parking lot for 4 months. She had been invisible to Dale and Sherry for years. The kind of invisible that happens when people decide you're a resource to be extracted rather than a person to be reckoned with. She had been invisible to the police officer who had said civil matter. She had been invisible to the world in the particular way of older women who ceased to be seen by the culture that had once seen them, that had used their labor and their attention and their care and then moved on. She had been seen by Lily. She had been seen by Stone eventually from a different angle than she expected. She was visible now to Detective Voss, to Edmund Briggs, to the Iron Wolves, and to Sherry Calloway, who was currently being questioned in a Phoenix police station. Visibility was not comfortable, but it was effective. She heard the front door and Carla's voice announcing her return from the store, followed by Lily's voice, which meant school had ended, which meant it was later than she had thought. She turned from the window. Lily came into the kitchen at speed and stopped when she saw Ruth's expression. "What happened?" Lily asked. "A great deal," Ruth said. All of it moving in the right direction. Lily climbed onto the kitchen stool and began arranging the contents of her backpack on the counter with the organizational approach of a 7-year-old, which was to say with great apparent purpose and no discernible system. "Dad says you're going to get your house back," she said. "I intend to," Ruth said. "Will you still be here?" Lily asked. She was not looking at her. She was very focused on the arrangement of a pencil case and 3 library books. Ruth looked at her. At the red boots on the stool rung, and the serious face, and the way she asked the questions sideways, the way children asked the questions that mattered most, approaching them indirectly because the direct approach was too frightening. "I'll still be here," Ruth said. Not because she had made a definitive decision about the shape of her future, but because she understood what the question was really asking. And the real question deserved a real answer. Lily nodded once and continued arranging. Outside, a motorcycle turned into the lot. Then another. The sound of the Iron Wolves returning from wherever they had been settling in the rhythm of the compound resuming. Stone's voice from the lot, then his footsteps on the gravel. Ruth poured water into a glass and stood at the kitchen counter and thought about what came next. In 6 days, there would be a court date. Sherry was in a police station. Dale was about to understand the shape of the thing he had been part of. Briggs was filing. She had been a nurse for 31 years, and she understood that the crisis was not over when the emergency intervention succeeded. The crisis was over when the patient was stable, and the underlying condition was addressed, and the recovery was underway. They were still in the intervention phase, but the direction had changed. She was no longer retreating. She was no longer invisible. She was Ruth Calloway, 68 years old, former registered nurse, resident of a compound in South Phoenix with 2 healing gunshot wounds and a court date in 6 days. And she had not come this far by being the kind of person who gave up when things were difficult. Stone came in through the back door. He looked at her. "Voss called," he said. "Sherry's lawyer showed up. She's not talking, but Dale talked for 3 hours. He paused. "She was going to take the house from him too. He knows." He was quiet for a moment. He asked if he could speak to you. Ruth set down her glass. "Not yet," she said. When this is over, when I know what needs to be said." She looked at Stone. "There are things between a mother and a child that don't get resolved in a police station in the middle of a criminal investigation. There are things that need their own time." Stone nodded. He understood about things that needed their own time. She could see it in his face. He was a man who had lost a wife and built a life around a daughter and run a motorcycle club and carried it all forward. He understood very well about things that needed time and the patience to wait for it. 6 days, Ruth said. 6 days, he agreed. Outside, the mesquite tree was moving in the afternoon wind, dropping its small brown pods onto the dry grass. And the sound of engines from the lot came through the walls like a heartbeat. The court date was 5 days away when Sherry Calloway made her next move, and it was not the one they had prepared for. At 7 in the morning, Ruth's phone rang. The number was blocked. She answered because she had learned in 4 months of navigating a situation where the people who wanted to harm her had more resources than she did, that blocked calls carried information, even when the person calling was hostile. "Ruth." The voice was calm, composed. Sherry's voice, which she had heard perhaps 200 times over 11 years, and had always registered as pleasant and neutral, and slightly too careful the way voices are when they're managed rather than natural. Ruth sat up in the chair by the window. The morning light was early and pale. "Sherry." "You should drop this," Sherry said. "The court case, the investigation, all of it." Her voice hadn't changed from its characteristic pleasant neutrality, which Ruth found more unnerving than anger would have been. "I know that's a difficult thing to hear, but consider where you are. You're in a borrowed room in a motorcycle club compound. You've been shot twice. You have no money, no home, no family." A pause. "I'm offering you a negotiated resolution, a monthly payment from the trust, enough to rent something comfortable. A clean break." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked out the window at the mesquite tree. "Sherry," she said, "I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say." "I'm listening." "You used my son. You fraudulently took my house. You hired someone to hurt me. You fed information to that person through a man you paid inside the club that has been protecting me." She paused. "And you are calling me at 7 in the morning with an offer you believe I might accept, because you believe I'm frightened and exhausted and without options." Another pause. "I want you to understand that I have heard worse news than this delivered in person by better people. I want you to understand that I have spent 48 years in professional circumstances where the answer was always, 'What can we do?' Never, 'Is there anything to be done?' And I want you to understand that whatever you believe my situation to be, you have consistently underestimated me, and you are doing it again right now." A long silence. "The phone call is being recorded," Ruth said. "I turned that feature on 3 days ago, on the advice of my attorney." She paused. "I suggest you speak with your lawyer." She ended the call. She sat for a moment, looking at the morning light. Then she opened her door and walked down the hallway to the kitchen, where Stone was making coffee. "Sherry called," she said. He turned. She told him what had been said. He listened with the stillness he always brought to concerning information, then reached for his phone. "Voss first," he said. "I agree." He made the call. Voss picked up on the second ring. Ruth watched Stone describe the conversation in his concise, factual way. She watched his expression not change, which meant Voss was telling him something expected rather than something new. He put the phone down. "Sherry made bail yesterday evening," he said. "Voss forgot to call me. She's apologizing." He picked up his coffee. "But the recording is clean. That's a new charge." Ruth nodded. She sat at the kitchen table and accepted the cup he set in front of her. And they sat in the early morning quiet and drank coffee and thought about the court date, which was now 4 days away. On day 3 before the hearing, Briggs called with an update. The competency motion had been filed and rejected. The emergency injunction on the property had been granted. The documents from Sherry's storage unit had been submitted as evidence. The prosecution was moving on criminal charges in parallel with the civil fraud case. The hearing is still proceeding as scheduled, Briggs said. Opposing counsel filed a delay motion yesterday. The judge denied it. He paused. We're in good shape, Ruth. Good, she said. But I want you to prepare for the possibility that the hearing itself is eventful. Sherry has hired a different lawyer, one who is known for aggressive courtroom tactics. I've been in rooms where people were dying, Ruth said. I think I can manage aggressive courtroom tactics. I believe you, Briggs said. I just want you to know what to expect. What she expected and what happened were two different things. On the morning of the court date, 2 days later than the day 3 conversation, Ruth rose at 5:30. She dressed in the clothes Carla had taken her to buy the week before, which were suitable for a courthouse and comfortable for someone whose wounds still needed to be dressed daily. She ate breakfast. She drank coffee. She reviewed her notes one more time, the notebook from under the driver's seat of the Buick, which Stone had retrieved from the lot and delivered to her on her second day at the compound. Stone drove her. Lily was at school. Carla stayed at the compound. 44 Iron Wolves formed a loose escort that stayed 2 blocks away from the courthouse at Stone's direction because they understood that their presence directly at the courthouse entrance could be used by opposing counsel to argue intimidation. Briggs was waiting on the courthouse steps with 2 associates. He reviewed the morning's strategy in 3 minutes with the efficiency of a man who had done this a very large number of times. Ruth listened, asked 2 questions, received the answers, and went inside. The courtroom was standard, wood and fluorescent light, and the smell of legal documents and people who had spent their careers navigating a system built on precision. Ruth sat at the plaintiff's table and looked straight ahead and breathed. Sherry's lawyer was a man named Aldridge, who had silver hair and wore a suit that cost more than Ruth's old monthly mortgage payment, and spoke with the kind of aggressive confidence that indicated someone who had won, often by projecting the inevitability of winning. He filed 3 motions in the first 20 minutes that Briggs handled with the systematic patience of a man disarming them one at a time. Dale was in the room. He was seated at the back, not at the table, because his lawyer had negotiated a cooperation agreement, and he was there as a potential witness rather than a defendant. Ruth had not looked at him. She knew where he was. She did not look. The judge was a woman of 62 named Harriet Cho, who had the manner of someone who had presided over enough fraud cases to have a very accurate instinct for their shape and was not inclined to be impressed by aggressive tactics. She reviewed Briggs's evidence. She reviewed the document from the notary investigation. She reviewed the forensic accounting report on the property transfers. She reviewed the certification of the storage unit documents and the analysis connecting them to Sherry's financial network. Aldridge argued. Briggs responded. The judge asked a question about the timeline of the account transfers. Briggs answered it precisely. The judge made a note. Then the judge looked up. Counselor, she said to Aldridge, your client is present in this courtroom while under a bail arrangement that specifically requires her to have no contact with the plaintiff in this matter. She looked at Sherry, who was seated at the defense table in an expensive jacket with the composed expression she always wore. Can you explain to me why there is a recording of your client calling the plaintiff 3 days ago and offering to pay her to drop this case? Aldridge's composure shifted. A very small shift, but Ruth had been reading small shifts in people's faces for 31 years. Your Honor, my client was not aware that the contact restriction. She was aware, Ruth said. The judge looked at her. Briggs put a hand on her arm. A gentle, professional redirect. The recording has been submitted, Briggs said, in which my client clearly informs the defendant that the call is being recorded and advises her to speak with her attorney. The defendant continued the call for 42 seconds after that advisement, during which she made additional statements relevant to the matter. The judge looked at the recording transcript on her desk. The courtroom was very quiet. Sherry was looking at the table in front of her. For the first time in Ruth's observation, her expression had changed. The careful neutrality had slipped, and underneath it was something rawer. Not grief, not remorse, but the particular look of a person who has encountered a situation that has moved past their control and who has not fully processed what that means. Bailiff, the judge said, please note that we will be addressing the bail violation following the conclusion of this hearing. The hearing ran 3 hours. Briggs presented his case methodically. Aldridge pushed where he could and was redirected repeatedly by the judge. At one point, when Aldridge attempted to introduce a psychiatric evaluation prepared by a doctor who had never examined Ruth, the judge looked at it for 30 seconds and said that in her experience, any psychiatric evaluation prepared at the request of the party being sued for fraud and delivered 2 days before a hearing was not worth the paper it was printed on, and she set it aside. Ruth sat at the plaintiff's table and breathed and listened and watched and waited. When the judge rendered her preliminary ruling, it was in Ruth's favor on all primary counts. The property transfer was declared void. The trust arrangement was declared invalid. The accounts were ordered unfrozen, pending final resolution. A date was set for the criminal fraud proceedings, which would be separate from the civil matter, but connected to it. Sherry Calloway's bail was revoked. Ruth watched them walk Sherry out of the courtroom and thought about the phone call at 7 in the morning and the voice that had been so careful and so composed and that had ultimately given Voss another charge to add to the stack. She had been a nurse for 31 years. She had seen people make decisions that hurt them because they could not imagine that the world would not arrange itself around their certainty. She had seen it in patients who refused treatment and in families who insisted on interventions that helped no one. The inability to update your picture of reality when the evidence changed. Sherry had been very certain. She had been wrong. Briggs was beside her, his hand extended. That, he said, was as clean as it gets. Ruth shook his hand. Behind her, near the back of the courtroom, she heard a chair move. She heard footsteps. She did not turn around. Ruth, Dale's voice. She had not heard it since the night before the locks changed 4 months ago, and a lifetime. She turned. He looked older than she expected, smaller. The softness that had always been in him had become something else, something that looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy and had just set it down and discovered that putting it down didn't feel the way he had expected. His eyes were red. He had not been sleeping. They stood in the emptying courtroom and looked at each other. She had a great deal she could say. She had 4 months worth of it, 4 months of sleeping in a car and eating at food banks and washing her face in gas station bathrooms because of choices he had allowed to be made in his name. She had things she could say that were true and earned, and that she would say eventually. In the time she had told Stone was not this time. Not today, she said. Dale nodded. His jaw worked. I know. He stopped. I'm sorry is a small word for what I did. Yes, she said. It is. She walked past him and out of the courtroom and through the courthouse doors into the October Arizona sunlight, which was bright and warm and direct in the way the desert sun always was. And she stood on the courthouse steps and breathed. Stone was at the bottom of the steps. He had not been in the courtroom, but he was here. He looked up at her and she looked down at him, and there was a question in his face that was answered by whatever he saw in hers. How'd it go? He asked. In our favor, she said. On everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Carla made pot roast. She started it this morning on the basis that things were going to go well. That's a lot of confidence, Ruth said. She's usually right. Ruth came down the courthouse steps toward the truck. The sky above Phoenix was the particular deep blue that came in the desert on clear October days. A blue that looked almost unreal against the pale stone of the courthouse facade and the distant dark line of mountains at the edge of the valley. She had lived under this sky for 40 years, and she looked at it now with the specific gratitude of someone who has had a reminder of what it means to still be here to see it. Let's go home, she said. Stone drove. She watched Phoenix move past the window. In 2 blocks, she could see 3 Iron Wolves bikes tucked against a wall waiting. When Stone's truck appeared, they fell in behind. Ruth looked at the city. Her city, the one she had lived in for 40 years, that had become temporarily alien to her, that she was reclaiming not by reversing time, but by building forward from where she stood. The pot roast smelled like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. She went inside. The pot roast was very good. Carla had been cooking since 9 in the morning with the focused confidence of someone who believed in edible outcomes as a form of faith, and the result was on the table when they arrived home, thick with gravy and carrots, with biscuits that had gone golden on top, and a salad that Ruth suspected was decorative rather than expected. Lily sat across the table and ate with the efficient attention of a child who has been told that this meal is important without fully understanding why, and who has decided the correct response is to be present and not ask questions. Stone ate with the relief of a man who had been running on coffee and vigilance for 6 days and had arrived at a moment when it was possible briefly to simply sit. Ruth ate. She had not eaten a real meal at a real table since before the locks changed. She had eaten at the food bank and at the senior center and in her car and at the hospital. She had eaten functionally the way she had approached everything for 4 months, as a logistical requirement rather than a pleasure. The food at Carla's table was good enough to register as something other than logistics, and she let herself register it without apology. "Good?" Lily asked. "Very good," Ruth said. Lily nodded with satisfaction. "I helped. I stirred the gravy. That's the most important part," Ruth said seriously. Lily accepted this assessment and returned to her food. After dinner, Ruth helped clear the table. Carla protested. Ruth ignored the protest, and they worked in the easy parallel of two women who understood kitchen choreography. Stone took Lily outside to look at the stars, which were very clear from the compound because the residential lighting was minimal, and the desert air was dry enough to let the sky show what it had. "I heard it went well," Carla said, handing Ruth a plate to dry. "Very well. Good." Carla was quiet for a moment. "He's been worried, Stone. He doesn't say so, but..." She handed another plate. "He's been worried since the parking lot." Ruth dried the plate. "He had good reason. He worries about the right things," Carla said. "It took him time to learn which things were worth worrying about and which weren't after Celia died, his wife. But he knows now." She glanced sideways. "Lily needed someone like you. She needed to see what it looked like when a woman decided to fight for herself, regardless of what it cost. Celia was like that. Lily was too young to remember her properly." Ruth considered this. She had not thought about what she was demonstrating to Lily. She had been managing her own survival, which was sufficient occupation. But she thought about it now, about the crayon drawing with the wings, about the question asked sideways from the kitchen stool, about a 7-year-old watching a woman she'd called invisible turn out to be the opposite. "That's generous," Ruth said. "It's accurate," Carla said firmly. They finished the dishes in comfortable quiet. In the weeks that followed the hearing, Ruth's life organized itself into new shapes. The injunction had been granted, and Briggs was moving the full reversal of the property transfer through the court system. It was not fast, but it was moving, and moving in the right direction, which Ruth had learned was the most important thing about legal processes. Direction mattered more than speed. The criminal proceedings were a separate track, and Detective Voss managed them with the same careful precision she brought to everything. Sherry remained in custody. Her bail had been revoked at the hearing, and her attorney's subsequent motion for reconsideration had been denied. Dale had entered a cooperation agreement, which meant he was working with prosecutors and would testify. The cooperation agreement included a reduced plea that Ruth had been consulted about and had not opposed because reducing Dale's sentence in exchange for everything he could give the prosecution was effective strategy, and she was interested in effective strategy. Dex Pruitt was extradited from New Mexico and charged with accessory to conspiracy and breach of fiduciary duty to the club, which was a private matter handled entirely within the Iron Wolves, and whose resolution Ruth was not asked about and did not inquire into. She had heard from Stone that Dex's patch had been burned. She had not asked about the details beyond that. 3 weeks after the hearing, Edmund Briggs called with additional news. "We found a third property," he said. "A rental in Glendale that Sherry had purchased using funds from your trust before the transfer was challenged. She's been collecting rent on it for 2 years." He was quiet for a moment. "We're adding it to the restitution claim." Ruth absorbed this. "How long was she planning this?" "Based on the document trail," Briggs said, "she started preparing the framework approximately 4 years ago. When your husband's health began to decline," he paused, "she saw an opportunity in your vulnerability and prepared for it very carefully over a long time." Ruth thought about the 11 years of Sherry at family dinners and holiday gatherings, the careful, pleasant voice, the sideways glances at Dale. 4 years of preparation. 4 years of treating her as an asset to be extracted rather than a person to be considered. She thought about what it meant to be looked at and not seen. "Get everything back," she said. "That's the plan," Briggs said. The house on Crestwood Lane was returned to her on a Tuesday in late November, 7 weeks after the hearing, by order of the Maricopa County Court. Briggs called her in the morning. She hung up and sat in the chair by the window in the room off the back hallway of the Hargrove house, and looked at the mesquite tree, which had lost most of its pods now, and stood clean and bare-branched in the November cool. Stone was in the kitchen when she came out. He looked at her face and waited. "They're giving it back," she said. He nodded. She watched something relax in him, slowly, the way tension releases in a person who has been holding something at readiness for a long time and has finally received permission to set it down. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you." She sat at the table. "For the lawyer, for the room, for 42 motorcycles at 7 in the morning." She paused. "For the chair in the hospital." "We said not to thank us," he said. "I'm thanking you anyway," she said. "I'm 68 years old, and I've earned the right to ignore advice I disagree with." Stone looked at her for a moment, with an expression she had come to recognize over the past 7 weeks as his version of amusement. A contained warmth that didn't often reach his face, but was visible if you were paying attention. "Fair," he said. "I need to tell you something," Ruth said. He sat across from her. He gave her his attention the way he always gave it, fully, without distraction. "I've been thinking about the house," she said. "About going back." She paused. "I can go back. Legally and physically, it's my house, and I can go back." Another pause. "But I've been sitting in the chair by that window for 7 weeks looking at that tree, and I've been eating pot roast and watching Lily do her homework at this table, and I've been woken up at 6 by the sound of bikes starting in the lot. And I want you to know that I am aware of what I have here, and that going back to an empty house in North Phoenix is not the same as going back to something I want." Stone was quiet. "I'm not asking for permission to stay," she said. "I'm telling you that if you were to tell me there was a reason for me to remain here, I would not need a great deal of convincing." Stone looked at his coffee cup. He turned it once in his hands. When he looked up, his expression was the one she had seen in the hospital. On the 4th day, the look of a man revising a story in real time. "Lily calls you Grandma Ruth," he said. "She started that 3 weeks ago." "I know." He set the cup down. "I heard her on the phone with her teacher explaining that she had a grandmother now." He paused. "Her teacher told her that was wonderful." Lily agreed. Lily was pretty emphatic about it. Ruth looked at the table. "The room is yours," Stone said. "For as long as you want it. For as long as you'll stay." He paused. "And if at some point you want to go back to the house on Crestwood, I'll drive you. And if you want to rent it out and stay here, that's also something we can discuss." He stopped. "This isn't complicated, Ruth. You belong here. I've known it since the hospital. Lily's known it since before that." "How long have you known it since before that?" she asked. "Since she told me about the woman in the green coat who cleaned up the glass," he said. "And I thought she'd made you up." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "The room is good," she said. "I'd like to keep it." "Good," Stone said. "Lily will be relieved. She's been anxious about it. She's 7. She's very thorough for 7. Ruth understood because she had watched Lily be very thorough about the things that mattered to her, and she was apparently one of those things, which was information she had decided to receive without deflecting. The question of the house was resolved by December. She rented it. A young couple who had been on the waiting list for a rental in the North Phoenix neighborhood for 18 months signed a lease and moved in, and the monthly check went into an account Briggs had helped her set up. The financial recovery was not complete. The restitution proceedings would take time. But the practical situation had shifted entirely. She was not sleeping in a Buick. She was, it turned out, useful in ways she had not initially foreseen. The first time it happened was 5 weeks after the hearing. A member of the club, a man named Cooper, who was 36 and had been riding with Iron Wolves for 8 years, came to Stone with a problem he didn't know how to describe. His mother, 63, was in a situation that had elements of what had happened to Ruth: an older property, a relative with access decisions being made without her knowledge. Stone brought Cooper to the kitchen table and looked at Ruth with a question. Ruth sat down across from Cooper. She asked him what he'd noticed. She asked him about the documents his mother had mentioned. She asked about the timeline. She listened carefully and asked precise follow-up questions in the way she had asked patients to describe symptoms, because the symptom that was described first was rarely the central problem, and the actual problem usually emerged only after you had built enough trust that the person stopped managing the story and started just telling it. After 40 minutes, she told him 3 things to look for, 1 person to call, and 1 thing to do immediately. Cooper called her a week later to say that the immediate action had been the right one, and that the thing to look for had been found, and that the person he had called was handling it. After that, word moved the way word moves in tight communities, quietly and efficiently. She did not advertise anything. She was not running a service. But people sat across from her at the kitchen table, and she listened and asked questions and gave what information she had. And over the course of 3 months, this happened 11 more times. And 9 of those times, the situation was caught before it became irreversible. She talked to Voss about it. Voss, it turned out, had been looking for exactly this kind of bridge. A person who could identify fraud situations early, who moved in communities where law enforcement had limited reach and limited trust. They developed an informal arrangement, not official, not formal, a line Ruth could call when something needed law enforcement attention, and a line Voss could call when she needed someone to talk to a family who wouldn't talk to police. "You know what this is?" Voss said to her one afternoon over coffee. "It's what I can do," Ruth said. "There's a name for it," Voss said. "In community health. Community health worker. Trusted intermediary." The research on their effectiveness is significant. Ruth knew the research. She had been a nurse. She had read it. She had also lived the thing the research described, which was the irreducible fact that people told certain people things they would not tell official structures, and that certain people, by virtue of who they were and where they were and what they had been through, were uniquely positioned to be those people. She was one of them. She told Stone about it on a Sunday evening. He listened. He was quiet for a moment. "We can help," he said. "The club, resources, connections, presence." He paused. "We've been needing something to do with the practical side of the thing we already do informally anyway. This is a better structure for it." They called it SEEN. It was not a formal organization initially. It was a phone number on a card and a network of people who would answer when called. And it was Ruth Calloway's name at the bottom of the card, which was the part that mattered. People trusted the name because they knew the story or enough of it. They trusted the Iron Wolves because the Iron Wolves had over 20 years built a specific kind of reputation in South Phoenix that was complicated to describe to outsiders, but was understood precisely by the people who lived there. By March, SEEN had helped 23 families. By June, they had a formal nonprofit filing and a grant from the county health department and a volunteer coordinator named Patricia Alvarez, formerly of the Legal Aid Clinic, who had decided to pivot her career and who brought institutional knowledge that Ruth did not have and that the program needed. Ruth came home from a meeting with Patricia to find Lily at the kitchen table with a project spread across the surface. It was a poster hand-drawn with a phone number and the word SEEN in large letters, below which Lily had drawn a woman in a green coat standing between a small figure in red boots and something large and dark. Teacher said we could bring in posters for the community board at school, Lily said. So I made one. Ruth looked at the poster. The woman in the green coat had wings again. This was apparently how Lily drew her, which Ruth had decided to regard as a creative preference rather than a theological statement. It's very good, Ruth said. I traced the letters, Lily said, slightly defensive about the quality of the lettering. The tracing is excellent. Lily seemed satisfied. Mrs. Whitman said it was about your organization. Yes, she said it helps people who are invisible. Ruth looked at the poster. That's one way to describe it. You were invisible, Lily said. Not as a judgment, as a fact she had learned and organized into her understanding of how things worked. You fixed the glass and nobody knew. But then you weren't invisible anymore. No, Ruth said. I wasn't. I think being invisible is bad, Lily said with the certainty of 7 years old. Sometimes it's a survival strategy, Ruth said. Lily considered this, but it's better not to need it. Ruth thought about parking lots in the dark and notebooks under car seats and $47 in a cup holder and the particular discipline of invisibility, the way you learn to make yourself small and undemanding and forgettable, because that was how you stayed safe. She thought about Lily's voice saying her name in the parking lot. She thought about Stone's hand on the gurney rail. She thought about the kitchen table and Carla's pot roast and 44 motorcycles on the highway, and Edmund Briggs's suspenders, and Patricia Alvarez pivoting her career, and Detective Voss's direct line. Yes, she said. It's better not to need it. Lily nodded and returned to her poster. On a Tuesday in February, 5 months after the parking lot, Ruth drove back to Crestwood Lane for the first time. She drove alone. She had not asked Stone to come, and he had not offered, because he had developed an accurate instinct for which things she needed to do by herself. She pulled up in front of the house at 9 in the morning and sat in the car and looked at it. The house looked smaller than she remembered. She had always heard people say this about places from their past, that distance makes them larger in memory than they are in fact. But she had always suspected the observation was metaphorical. It was not. The house on Crestwood Lane was a 2-story stucco with a front walk bordered by roses that she had planted herself, and repainted shutters that had gone gray again, and a front door that she could see from the car had a new lock set that had not been there when she last stood inside it. She got out of the car. She walked up the front path. The roses were overgrown. Nobody had tended them in 5 months. She would need to cut them back before they got worse, which was a task she was noting mentally rather than planning to execute today. Today was for something else. She stood at the front door and tried the key that Edmund Briggs had sent her after the court order, and the key worked, and she went inside. The house was cold. It had been empty since the court order had cleared out the last of Dale and Sherry's occupation of it, and the thermostat had been set low by someone methodical who had understood that empty houses needed to be protected from temperature extremes. The air smelled of dust and the particular absence of habitation, the way places smelled when the living they had contained had moved out. She walked through the rooms. She had expected to feel more. She had expected grief, or anger, or relief, or some combination of the three that resolved itself into a specific emotion she could name. What she felt was something quieter and more complicated. She felt the way she felt after a very long shift at the hospital, when the work was done and the patients were stable, and the outcome was as good as the outcome could be. Not triumph, not elation. A clean, tired recognition that the effort had been worthwhile and was over, and that something new was now beginning. In the kitchen, someone had left a plant on the windowsill. A small succulent in a clay pot, unremarkable. The kind of thing that appeared in houses the way objects accreted around any lived-in space. She didn't know whose it was. She decided it could stay. She went upstairs. The bedroom was bare. The furniture that had been hers was gone. Sherry had removed most of the contents before the court order, which was technically theft and was part of the restitution claim. The closet was empty. The window looked out on the neighbor's oak tree, which was leafless in February, its branches black and precise against the pale sky. She stood in the empty bedroom of her own house and thought about the room off the back hallway in the Hargrove compound. The mesquite tree outside the window, the glass of water on the table. She went back downstairs and outside and sat on the front step. It was a good house. It had been a good house for 22 years. The roses were overgrown, and the shutters needed paint again, and the lock set was new, and the rooms were empty, but it was structurally sound and in a good neighborhood, and she had paid for it herself and fought for it, and she was going to rent it to the young couple who had been waiting, and she was going to use the income to fund the things she was building. She was not going to live in it. She understood this with the clarity she gave to things she had worked out through careful thought over time rather than arrived at quickly. She had worked it out during the weeks of sitting by the mesquite tree and eating at the kitchen table and watching Lily do homework and hearing Stone's voice in the compound yard at 6 in the morning. She had arrived at it without drama. Her home was on the south side of Phoenix in a motorcycle club compound with a room that had a window facing a mesquite tree and a family that had been assembled from unlikely parts and that held together because the people in it had decided that it would. She stood up from the front step. She walked back to the car. She sat for a moment looking at the house, at the roses that needed cutting, at the shutters that needed painting. Then she started the car. She called Stone. "House is good," she said. "Tell the renters it's ready." A pause. "That was quick. I've had 5 months to decide," she said. "I drove over to confirm the decision. The decision is confirmed." Another pause. "You okay?" "Yes," she said. And she was. She was very specifically all right in the precise way the word could mean when you meant it, and not when you used it as a deflection. "Lily's making biscuits," Stone said. "She's been at it for 45 minutes. Carla says the kitchen looks like a flower bomb went off." "I'll be home in 20 minutes, Ruth said. She drove south through Phoenix back toward the compound, back toward the mesquite tree and the kitchen table, and the particular life she had built in the rubble of the one that had been taken from her. The criminal trial concluded in April. Ruth had testified in March in a courtroom in downtown Phoenix in front of a jury of 12 people who had listened to 3 days of evidence and 1 day of testimony and had deliberated for 9 hours. Sherry Calloway was convicted on 7 counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud, elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit assault, and the lesser charge that came from the voicemail Dex had sent to the fake orderlies before the hospital break-in. The sentence was 14 years. Dale had pleaded to 2 counts under the cooperation agreement. He received 3 years of probation and a restitution order. He had not been at the trial in the way an active participant is present. He had been there as a man fulfilling an obligation, doing the one useful thing left available to him, which was to tell the truth about what had happened and who had caused it. Ruth had looked at him once when he finished testifying. He had looked back. There had been nothing to say in that moment in a courtroom. There was still nothing to say, and there might be for a while because some things needed time that could not be scheduled. But the door was there. Not open, not yet, but present. She could see it from where she stood. Stone was on the courthouse steps again. The sun was different in April, higher and warmer, the desert beginning to shift toward the heat that would arrive in June and stay until October. She came down the steps toward him. "Done," she said. 14 years, he said, plus restitution. Edmund is already working on the full accounting. Stone looked at her. "How are you?" She thought about it. She was 68 years old. She had 2 healing gunshot scars and a legal aid case that had become a nonprofit and a rented house on Crestwood Lane and a room with a window facing a mesquite tree in a motorcycle club compound in South Phoenix. She had 23 families who had called a number on a card and been heard and helped. She had a 7-year-old who drew her with wings and a man who had sat in a hospital chair for 18 hours when he didn't have to, and an informal arrangement with a detective and a very good attorney with suspenders. She had been invisible for 4 months, and then she had stopped, and the stopping had cost her things that had needed to be paid, and had given her things she had not known to ask for. "I'm well," she said, and she meant it with the precision she gave to words that mattered. The day scene held its first formal community event in July. Ruth stood at the back of the room in a recreation center in South Phoenix and watched 37 people find seats. They were mostly older, mostly women, the demographic that financial fraud targeted with the highest efficiency because the culture had decided they were both vulnerable and invisible. Some had come with family members, some had come alone. Patricia spoke first because she was the executive director, and that was her job. She was good at it. She spoke about the program without sentimentality, which was correct, because the people in the room didn't need sentiment. They needed information and access and the specific reassurance that there were people who would take them seriously. Then Ruth spoke. She was not a public speaker. She had not been a public speaker at 50 or 40 or 30. She was not one now. But she was a woman who had spent 31 years talking to frightened people in clear language, and she knew how to do that, which was perhaps sufficient. She told them what had happened to her. She told them precisely and without decoration, beginning with the papers on the kitchen table and the signature on the trust documents that was not quite hers, and moving through the change locks and the $47 and the parking lot and the gun and the hospital and the courtroom and the house that had been given back. The room was very quiet. She told them about the notebook under the car seat. She told them about the voicemail. She told them about the phone call at 7 in the morning from a woman who had believed she was beaten and had underestimated her. She told them about sitting in the car in a parking lot in South Phoenix and deciding not to drive away. And then she told them what she had learned. What she had learned was that visibility was a choice within the limits of what circumstances permitted. That you could be invisible as a survival strategy, and that it was a legitimate strategy. She was not there to tell them that it wasn't, because she had used it herself and it had worked for a time in specific circumstances. But she had also learned that there was a moment when the strategy had to change. When the thing you were surviving toward required you to be seen because the systems that could help you could not help someone they couldn't see. She had learned that the right people in the right moment would see you if you let them. She had learned that family was not only blood, that it was also a motorcycle club's 44 bikes on a highway at 6 in the morning, and a lawyer with suspenders, and a detective who answered on the second ring, and a 7-year-old who drew wings on everyone she decided was worth the extra effort. She had learned that being worth something was not determined by what you owned, or what you had been given, or what had been taken from you. It was demonstrated in what you did with the moment you had. She had moved glass off a path where a child played. She had made herself a target for the person who wanted to hurt her. She had sat in a hospital bed and told a lawyer the precise facts of her case with 2 healing gunshot wounds, because the court date was in 6 days and precision mattered. She had been seen, and she was here. After the event, Ruth stood outside the recreation center in the July heat, which was significant, which was the desert, being honest. The Iron Wolves had provided security for the event, 8 of them, unobtrusive present. Stone was among them, which she had asked him not to bother with, and which he had done anyway. And she had decided to regard this as a characteristic of his that she had accepted. Lily had insisted on coming. She was inside with Carla, helping with the refreshment table, applying the organizational focus she brought to things she had decided were important. A woman approached Ruth. She was perhaps 70 with white hair and the careful posture of someone who had decided that posture was a form of dignity she could maintain regardless of circumstances. She had come alone. "I have a situation," the woman said. "Tell me," Ruth said. The woman told her. It took 7 minutes. Ruth listened without interrupting, asking 2 questions at precise moments when clarity was needed. When the woman finished, Ruth gave her 3 pieces of information and Patricia's card, and told her that she was not alone in this, and that the system had more options than it appeared to have, and that the first step was the hardest, and she had already taken it. The woman looked at her. How do you know it will work? Ruth thought about $47 in a cracked rear window and a notebook under a car seat. I don't, she said, but I know that not trying doesn't work. And I know the tools that are available. And I know that you're here, which means you decided to be visible. And visible is where it starts. The woman looked at her for a long moment. All right, she said. After she left, Stone came over. He had been standing 15 feet away in the manner of someone who was absolutely not listening, but had also been absolutely listening. That's the ninth one tonight, he said. Patricia has their information, Ruth said. They stood together outside the recreation center in the July heat. Across the lot, two of the Iron Wolves were talking to a man who had come to the event with his mother and who had questions of his own that were apparently better asked in the parking lot than inside. Celia would have liked you, Stone said. This was something he said rarely. She had learned that when he said rare things, he meant them with a weight proportional to their rarity. I would have liked her, Ruth said. Anyone who raised Lily well was someone worth knowing. He made the sound that was his version of a laugh. We'll call it a collaborative effort. Lily appeared in the doorway of the recreation center. She had a cup of lemonade in each hand and was navigating the step down with the careful attention of someone who has been told about spilling and has decided to take it seriously. I brought lemonade, she announced. I see that, Ruth said. It's from the table. Carla said we could have some. She arrived successfully at the bottom of the step and delivered one cup to Ruth and one to Stone with the satisfaction of a mission completed. The lady with the white hair was crying when she left, she said, but it was the good kind. Ruth looked at her. How do you know the difference? Stone asked. Lily considered this with the thoroughness she brought to all questions. She was crying, but she was also walking like she knew where she was going, she said. The bad kind is when you can't see where you're going. Ruth thought about Lily. She thought about everything she had learned in 47 years of hospitals, in 1 year of parking lots, in kitchens, in courtrooms, in recreation centers. She thought about what it meant to cry the good kind, the kind that didn't stop you, the kind that came with direction. That's right, she said. That's exactly right. The sun was going down over Phoenix, which it did in the summer, with a spectacular indifference, painting the sky in colors that looked like they belonged to a different, more theatrical world than the one you were standing in. The desert did not soften its colors. Red and orange and purple sharp-edged against the flat, dark line of the mountains. Ruth drank her lemonade. She was 68 years old. She had 2 scars she would carry for the rest of her life. She had a rented house on Crestwood Lane and a room with a mesquite tree outside the window, and an organization called Scene with 37 people in a database and growing. She had a lawyer who enjoyed her case, and a detective on speed dial, and an attorney who had started calling her the most efficient client he'd ever had, which she suspected was professional understatement. She had Lily, who drew her with wings. She had Stone, who had sat in a hospital chair all night because that was what you did. She had, in the most precise sense of the word, a family. Not the one she had come from, not the one she had tried to build with Dale, which had failed in the way that things failed when one party was willing to treat another as a means to an end. The family she had arrived at by being exactly who she was in a parking lot at 9:17 on a Thursday evening in October, which was a woman who could not walk past a danger without addressing it, even when the danger was pointed at her. 3 months after Scene's first formal event, Ruth received a call from a woman in Tucson who had heard about the program. The woman had a situation. Ruth drove to Tucson, which was 2 hours, and sat at a kitchen table and listened and gave the same 3 pieces of information and Patricia's number. On the way back, she drove past a section of I-10 where she had considered driving the night of the parking lot when Dale had been on the phone against the retaining wall, and she had thought about Tucson and a 3/4 tank of gas in the direction that was not toward danger. She had not gone that way. She had not needed to. She turned the radio on and drove north through the desert in the October dark, with the stars over the valley so bright and numerous that they looked from the highway like something that had been arranged deliberately. And she thought about Lily's question from 3 weeks ago. Is it better not to need it? Yes, she had said. It was better, but the path to not needing it had run straight through the middle of needing it, through the Buick, and the food bank, and the notebook, and the gun, and the hospital, and the courtroom, and every kitchen table conversation, and every phone number on every card. It had run through being invisible, and then deciding to be seen through having nothing, and then having exactly the right things through being alone, and then not being. Through a parking lot in South Phoenix where a woman in a green coat had looked at a path where a child played and could not walk past the broken glass. She took the exit toward Phoenix. She was going home. On the night before Scene's 6-month mark, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the program's intake records, which Patricia had sent her as a summary report. 41 cases in 6 months, 37 active, 18 fully resolved. 9 referred to law enforcement, of which 6 had resulted in charges. 2 families had recovered property. 4 had avoided the kind of loss Ruth had experienced because they'd called the number before the situation was irreversible. Stone came in from the lot and poured coffee and sat across from her. "You're doing the count," he said. "I'm looking at the data," she said. "Same thing." He looked at the papers. "How many?" 41. She set the papers down. "1 year ago, I didn't exist to anyone except the people who wanted to use me. Now I'm a data point in 41 other people's outcomes." She paused. "That's an unusual amount of change for 12 months. Stone looked at his coffee. "You know what I tell prospects when they come in new? Before they know anything, before they've learned the work, I tell them one thing." He turned the cup. "Your life before the club will always matter. Where you came from is what you bring in. But the life that counts is the one you build with the people who know what you are now." He looked up. "You built something worth counting." Ruth considered him across the table. She had been considering him in various ways for 7 months. She had built a precise understanding of him in that time, the way she had built precise understandings of people her whole career, by watching what they did rather than what they said. He had done the following things, among others. He had sat in a hospital chair. He had hired a lawyer without being asked. He had cleared a room. He had told her the truth about Dex without softening it. He had not asked her to be grateful or to become smaller than she was, and he had corrected Lily firmly once when Lily had told someone that Grandma Ruth lived with them, and he had said, "Ruth lives with us because she chooses to, which is different," and Lily had processed this and said, "Okay," and that had been that. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I was in the parking lot for 4 months, I stopped expecting anything from people. Not bitterly, just practically. I had ample evidence that the support structures I had assumed were there were either absent or hostile, and I organized my existence accordingly." She paused. "You disrupted that organizational principle significantly." "I'll try to be more predictable in the future," Stone said. "Please don't," Ruth said. He looked at her. The contained warmth that lived in his expression moved a little closer to the surface. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Saying things that aren't tactical." "Neither am I," Ruth said. "I've been a nurse and a widow and a woman sleeping in a car. None of those teach you to say the non-tactical thing. But I'm 68 years old, and I have 2 gunshot scars, and I've sat across from 41 strangers at kitchen tables and told them that being visible to the right people is worth the risk." She looked at him. "It seems inconsistent to practice that with everyone except you." Stone was quiet for a long moment. Outside the compound was doing what it did in the evenings, the sound of bikes and voices, the loose machinery of the people who lived there and came there and made the place what it was. Inside the kitchen, the light was warm, and Lily's latest drawings were taped to the refrigerator, and there was a succulent from the house on Crestwood Lane on the windowsill that Ruth had brought home with her because it had been there and it had needed someone. "I'm not looking for a different life than this one," Stone said finally. "This one. Lily, the club, the work. This is it for me." He paused. "But I've been short a few things in this life since Celia." He stopped. "A person who doesn't need taking care of, who takes care of things instead. Someone who makes Lily think harder about herself. He looked at the table. Someone who drinks coffee in the morning and tells me what she's thinking without prettying it up. Ruth said nothing. She was listening precisely. You've been all those things for 7 months, he said. I'm not sure when that became something I was counting on, but it did. He looked up. Is that something you're willing to be long-term? Ruth thought about the room with the mesquite tree window, the kitchen table, Lily with her wings and her thoroughly organized priorities. She thought about what she had told. The woman with white hair visible is where it starts. Yes, she said. It is. Outside the bikes idled, and the desert night came down over Phoenix, clear and dark and full of stars. And Ruth Calloway sat in the kitchen of the house that had become her home and accepted the things she had after a very long and difficult year, finally precisely allowed herself to want. 3 months after Scene's first formal event, Ruth received a call from a woman in Tucson who had heard about the program through a niece who had attended the community event. The woman's name was Margaret. She was 72. She had a situation involving her son-in-law and a power of attorney she had signed without fully understanding what it covered. Ruth told her to stay where she was and drove to Tucson, which was 2 hours south on the interstate, through desert that flattened and broadened until the skies seemed to occupy more space than the earth. She sat at Margaret's kitchen table and listened. She asked the questions she had learned to ask in the order she had learned to ask them, because the order mattered. The first questions were about what had happened. The later questions were about the documents. The last questions were about what Margaret wanted, which was the question people most often had not been asked, and which was always once asked the most important answer. Margaret wanted her house. She wanted her bank accounts. She wanted her son-in-law to understand what he had done. She did not want to lose her relationship with her daughter, who was the son-in-law's wife, and who Margaret believed had not known the full extent of what her husband had been doing. Ruth gave her 3 pieces of information and Patricia's number and the name of an attorney in Tucson who Briggs had recommended. She told her what to do first. She told her it would take time. She told her that time was what it took and that it was worth spending. On the way back, driving north through the October dark, with the stars crowded overhead the way they were in the desert away from city light, Ruth thought about the parking lot on Garfield Avenue, about the dumpster she had stood behind and the sound of Dale's voice, about the choice she had almost made and the one she had made instead. She thought about what she had said to the woman at the community event. Visible is where it starts. She had been saying it for 3 months now to 41 people, and each time she said it, she meant it in a slightly different way because she was still learning what it meant, the full weight and scope of it. She had been invisible for 4 months in a parking lot in South Phoenix. She had made herself invisible on purpose as a strategy because invisibility was what kept her safe in the specific circumstances she was navigating. It had been the right strategy for that time. She did not regret it. But the invisibility had also been something else underneath the strategy. It had been the accumulated result of years of being treated as a resource rather than a person, as a convenience rather than a presence, as something that occupied space without deserving to be seen in that space. Dale and Sherry had not invented that. They had inherited it from a culture that had been practicing it on women of a certain age for a very long time, that had decided that once a woman was past a certain point of obvious usefulness, she became not invisible exactly, but transparent, a presence that could be looked through. Ruth had spent 68 years being worth something, being a nurse for 31 of those years, being a mother, being a wife, being a neighbor, a friend, a volunteer, a voter, a gardener, a homeowner, paying her taxes and her mortgage and her debts, and attending to her responsibilities with the methodical diligence of someone who understood that the machinery of a life only ran if you maintained it. None of it had made her invisible to Dale and Sherry. What had made her invisible to them was their decision to see her as an obstacle rather than a person. That decision was theirs. She had not caused it, and she could not have prevented it. What she could do, and what she had done, was refuse to let their decision define what she was. She was not invisible. She was Ruth Calloway. She had been Ruth Calloway for 68 years, and she intended to be Ruth Calloway for as many more years as the desert and her body permitted. She took the exit toward Phoenix and drove south through the familiar streets toward the compound, and the lights of the city spread out around her. And she was not a woman returning to a car in a parking lot. She was a woman going home. The compound was lit when she arrived. Stone was in the lot, which was not unusual at this hour, talking to two of the club members near the bikes. He looked up when her car turned in and said something to the men and walked over. "How was Tucson?" he asked. "She'll be all right," Ruth said. "It will take time, but she has what she needs now." Stone nodded. He had learned over the months that this was the full report. Not the details of the case, which were Margaret's and not his, but the assessment, will she be all right? That was the thing that mattered, and Ruth always knew the answer, because she had spent 31 years making that assessment, and she was rarely wrong. "Lily left something for you," he said, "on the kitchen table." Ruth went inside. Carla had gone home for the evening. The kitchen was clean and quiet. On the table, weighted down by the salt shaker, was a folded piece of paper. Ruth unfolded it. It was a drawing. Lily had been making drawings for the Scene program posters with the phone number and the word Scene in large letters. And this was one of those, but it was also something else. It was a drawing of the parking lot on Garfield Avenue, which Ruth had described to Lily once months ago in passing. Lily had remembered it with the comprehensive, unedited memory of children. She had drawn the strip mall and the retaining wall and the motorcycles in the dumpster, and at the center of the lot, a woman in a green coat standing alone in the dark. Below the drawing and Lily's careful printing, this is where it started. Ruth sat down at the table and looked at it for a long time. This is where it started. She thought about the night she had first seen the broken glass and gone to get the paper bag from her car. She thought about the specific quality of that moment, the absolute absence of calculation in it. She had not been performing virtue or building towards something. She had simply looked at the glass and seen the child's path and done what she did. What she had always done, what she would always do. You could not know in the moment you made a decision what it was the beginning of. You could not know that the paper bag and the broken glass were the first steps of a sequence that would lead through a parking lot shooting and a hospital room and a courthouse and a kitchen table and 41 cases and a program called Scene and a family she had not planned for. You could only know what was in front of you and whether it needed to be addressed. The glass needed to be addressed. She had addressed it. Everything that followed had followed from that. She folded the drawing carefully and held it and thought about Margaret in Tucson sitting at her own kitchen table with Patricia's number and the name of a good attorney and the knowledge that someone had listened and taken her seriously. She thought about the 37 other people in the database. She thought about the woman at the community event who had walked away crying the good kind of tears, the kind where you could see where you were going. She thought about Stone in the parking lot on one knee, saying, "That is what we do." She thought about Lily running across a hospital room in red boots. She thought about the room with the mesquite tree outside the window, which was her room, in her home, in her life. She set the drawing down on the table and went to put the kettle on because it was late, and she had driven 4 hours, and she wanted tea, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the compound was settling into its night rhythms, and tomorrow there would be more work to do. And the work was worth doing, and she was the one to do it. The kettle heated. She made her tea. She sat at the table with the drawing and the tea and the warm kitchen light and the sound of the desert evening coming through the walls, quiet and steady, the way things sound when you are exactly where you are supposed to be. She was 68 years old. She had been invisible once, which had been a strategy, and then she had stopped, which had been a different kind of strategy, and now she was visible in ways she had not anticipated and could not have planned for, which was not a strategy at all, but simply what happened when you kept making the decision, moment by moment, to address the thing in front of you that needed to be addressed. The glass on the path, the child in the line of fire, the truth in a courtroom, the woman at a kitchen table with a situation she did not know how to navigate alone. All of it the same decision repeated in different shapes. Ruth Calloway drank her tea and looked at the drawing her daughter had made because that was what Lily was, her daughter, in the way that mattered, in the way that was built from choice and time and showing up and being present. And the desert night settled over Phoenix, and the bikes outside were quiet, and the compound was at rest, and she was home. In the spring, a card arrived from Margaret in Tucson. It was a plain card with a desert flower on the front, the kind sold in gas stations and pharmacy checkout lines. And inside, Margaret had written in the careful handwriting of someone who was taking the time to get it right. "I have my house back. I wanted you to know." Ruth put the card on the refrigerator beside Lily's drawings. Lily noticed it the following morning before school. She read it with the focused attention she brought to all text, then looked at Ruth. "Someone got their house back?" she asked. "Yes," Ruth said. Lily looked at the card for another moment. "Good," she said with the complete, uncomplicated satisfaction of someone for whom the outcome was entirely sufficient and required no further elaboration. Ruth thought that was about right. She poured her coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the mesquite tree which was coming back in the spring warmth, putting out small new leaves along the gray branches, the way desert plants did quietly and without announcement, simply responding to the conditions that made growth possible. That was enough. That had always been enough. She drank her coffee, and the morning came in through the window, warm and bright, and full of the particular clarity of desert light, which did not soften or apologize, which simply showed you what was there, and what was there was good.